I'm going to present a paper which basically looks at the civil service management in the context of province to local decentralization. Let me say that this kind of is a rare study because not a lot of work has been done in this area. Mostly decentralization, of course, looks at administrative decentralization. But what happened in Pakistan in the 2001 reform was that a centrally managed civil service was basically embedded in a devolved local government system. And this paper basically looks at that, how that affected decentralization outcomes in some ways, and how there was a two-way relationship where civil service itself was also affected. Unfortunately, at this stage, I didn't have a good empirical data, so this is still work in progress. Next step that I'm going to do is I've designed a survey that I'm going to administer to civil servants, and once those results are in, then of course this will be updated. So in this presentation, I'll begin by talking about civil service and decentralization objectives. So primarily what you'll look at is that decentralization aims at least two things. That there should be higher local responsiveness in policy and planning. So let's say local issues should be identified by locally elected representatives or accountable to the people, and they set the priorities as to what services are to be delivered in a jurisdiction, what level of services is to be provided, what mix of services is to be provided, and of course, how people are going to pay for those services. And then the second objective of decentralization reform is to engender higher local accountability. So public officials, when they work on their mandates under the law, and they produce and provide those services, then they should be held accountable for the results. Now, on the other hand, the centrally managed civil service in Pakistan is attuned to central rules, regulations, and norms. And let me say that the norms in Pakistani civil service actually are a very strong incentive to affect civil service behavior. Rules are of course there, but the group norms, how peer effects carry from within the group, are very strong, and I'll show you how they're working in the context of devolution. Then, of course, there is the issue of central standards, and this also I'll highlight later. How, despite this remarkable initiative in Pakistan of devolving provincial governments to local level, central standards kept on, working and pulling the systems in the other direction. And finally, the career incentives for the civil service are centrifugal. So let's say if you look at a grade 17 officer in the district, his promotion prospects and actually transfer which can happen with a high probability anytime will take him to the province. Or if he's a federal civil servant or she's a federal civil servant, then there is every likelihood that she will go to the federal government or to another province. In another study, I looked at civil service tenures in Punjab, and I found out that the average tenure for a secretary was 8 months. For the additional secretary, it was similar. For a deputy secretary, it was less than that. Same carries on to the district level positions for these civil servants. So this again is another important dimension. Now, what I highlight in this paper is that the organizational change between civil services and devolution is by no means one-sided. So, although initially the impressions were that the civil service would be affected by devolution, and that was a very common perception, not only in the general community but also in the civil service. What happened in the end was that actually civil service affected devolution and its implementation to a large extent. And I can also say that to some extent the rollback of local government system in 2009 could also be at least partially credited to the centralized civil service management. And the ease with which the provincial governments were able to round up everything, appoint administrators once again, appoint commissioners to oversee local governments, That was, that could be traced to the centralized civil service management. And one of the things that I touch upon in this paper is to what extent administrative decentralization, to whatever extent it was carried out, affected basically the outcomes of the revolution. Now, very briefly, I will touch upon that in 2001, as all of you know, that 6,125 local governments were created, I should say, out of the 4 provincial governments. The TMAs, the second tier of local government, was mostly staffed by local government cadres. These are distinct cadres, these are mostly provincial cadres, but they are dedicated to the local government. On the other hand, the district governments, which was kind of a new local government created in Pakistan, these were staffed by provincial or, in some cases, federal governments. 2 rounds of elections, as we know, were held, 2001 and 2005, and then since 2009, local governments have existed in name only. This is just, this table shows you how many local governments at different levels were created in the provinces. Unions were a local government, but they did not have direct service delivery functions. The service delivery functions were basically assigned to the districts and the TMAs, and the revenue raising powers were also given to these 2 levels of government. And that's, by the way, another story altogether, to what extent that materialized. Now, the magnitude of the change was huge for what I'm calling a centrally managed civil service. For example, in Punjab, when I looked at the 2009 budgetary data, there were more than 1 million positions for civil servants in the province. Out of these, more than around 65% were actually, so to say, assigned to the local governments. This total doesn't include TNAs because they're financed, as you know, from another budget, which is the local government budgets, for which, by the way, no consolidated accounts are created by the provinces even up till now. Now, the major changes for the civil service and the decentralization was that multiple units with local political authority were created. Now, this was a huge change for a civil service steeped in more than a century-old earlier colonial administration, followed by, often autocratic governments in Pakistan and sometimes democratic governments in the country. The change in the sense was that whereas working as a deputy commissioner in a district, the local politicians were treated more as a nuisance. Now they were given legitimate authority to basically set policy and program targets for you. And this was a major change for civil servants. In the initial years, this was one of the recurring complaints of the civil servants and a major source of their dissatisfaction. The second one was that there was a dispersion of authority. Whereas in the provincial government, like in Punjab, which is nowadays very centrally managed compared with even other provinces, it's very easy for a civil servant when there are, let's say, multiple directions or conflicting orders received by him, that he has or she has to follow what the chief minister says. In this case, this was a very new setting for civil servants trained in that kind of unidirectional authority, where the Nazim could give them certain directions and the provincial secretary could ask them to do something else, and the chief minister might still want something totally different. So that was another major change. Then, as I said, there were multiple levels of legitimacy which replaced the conventional authorities, and then, most importantly, which was not addressed adequately in laws for reasons that it was to develop in later years, that the intergovernmental relations between the newly created local governments and the province were a totally new area. Earlier on, for example, even between the 1979 law, the local governments didn't receive a huge amount of transfers, for example, from the province. Now, the district governments were given a lot of budgetary autonomy. New finance and planning offices, for example, for the first time were created at the local level. And all this meant that the district level senior civil servants like the DCO, they were perpetually engaged with the provincial government in negotiating different issues. For example, perhaps I mentioned it again, that in the budgetary sphere, whereas legally the local governments were given authority to, or budgetary autonomy, in practice that autonomy was curtailed a lot by directions that were passed down from the finance departments from time to time. And this is where the DCOs played a very important role, and they learned how to work with the provinces. Now, all these changes meant that there were opportunities and risks for the civil servants. The opportunities were that new initiatives were possible. They could respond to local needs for the first time. They could work with the local political sector and councils and shape the districts in a new manner. Whereas earlier on, their role was, of course, just to implement provincial directions. On the other hand, the problem was that councils lacked capacity to administer much of their newfound powers. For example, I've traveled to a very large number of districts and unions and TMAs during those years. And one of the common refrain by the councillors was that they lacked powers. And when you would probe what type of authority or power they were lacking, they said they cannot transfer teachers, or they cannot transfer an SHO or a patwari. So, for them also it was a learning process, and this of course meant added burdens for civil servants. Most of the time they were, dealing with these kinds of issues, which were not strictly legal, or they were not the formal authority of the local councillors or even the political executive, but because they were uninitiated in this new role, they were creating additional burdens for the civil service. Now, I should say that the approach perhaps is understandable. It is, you will find that in many other countries like Spain, even some other European countries, in Latin America, it's common that the chief civil servant in a local government could be appointed by a higher level of government. It's different from our system, but still in that practice it's sometimes used. And for the advantages that I list here, that it allows them to navigate these complex and evolving intergovernmental relations. They can rely on this, research to support this, that in the process of implementation of sometimes complex reforms, civil servants rely on informal networks or norms and assist the new local governments in dealing better with the provinces. And this was happening a lot in Pakistan as well. There is some research on Canadian local governments and Canadian provinces where civil service norms and informal relationships have been found to be actually helpful in evolving better intergovernmental relations. Now, the new realities for the civil service and how, like I was saying, this two-way relationship unfolded over time, that first of all, there was atomized authority and control. So for this centrally oriented civil service, from the 5 authorities, like 4 provinces and 1 federal government, they now started working for 505 local governments, basically the district and the TMA levels in the country. Now, multiple controls and directions were faced by the civil servants. In my multiple interviews with DCOs and lower level civil servants, basically from management partners, posted in these positions, they would often raise this issue that there is a law-provided formal authority to the Nazim, but informally, because the posting and transfer was still controlled by the province, most of the time the DCOs would act on provincial instructions given by the Chief Secretary or Sectoral Secretary or even the Chief Minister. Provincial program priorities were still weighing very heavily. So we did a paper in, I think, 2006 where we found that the size of the vertical programs in almost all districts was at times more than 10 times what they were receiving, what they were spending from their own budgets. So since I'll be running out of time very soon, so I'll just quickly highlight some of the other main findings here. On the other hand, there was enhanced space for senior civil servants for the first time. Whereas as deputy commissioners, mostly they were concerned with law and order, public order situations, and very little was happening with development. What had happened actually in the decade of 70s, 80s, and 90s, that democracy had created another kind of issue for the district level administration. that the line departments would not pay heed to the deputy commissioner as it would be happening perhaps in the classical period. The reason for that one was purely political accountability. When an axiom of a highway department or a district education officer or the district health officer, they were directly accountable to their secretary, to the minister. And therefore DC had very little formal authority over them, which even if they were there, that was diluted over time. But what decentralization did was that it created this new office of DCO with formal authority over all these line departments. And what I experienced that at that time I was once managing a program for Asian Development Bank, and most of these newly appointed deputy DCOs were asking for training in development, which was a surprising demand because the civil service training, the civil service post-induction training was basically focusing on law, revenue law and criminal law, and did touch upon very dilutively on development. So these, spaces were utilized by senior civil servants. Like, in Punjab, for example, 48,546 teachers were appointed. The government adopted a contract appointment policy, which I believe was very effective in addressing chronic absenteeism in health and education facilities. I did an evaluation, for example, in Punjab, where I found that material changes occurred over those years. There were multiple accountability channels, which were again a new thing for the civil servants. The ACR was given to the Nazim, but the countersigning authority was retained by the province. And those familiar with civil service rules know that the countersigning authority actually can overrule the initiating officer's remarks. And this was happening in many cases. There was a very large number of police officials and DCOs who never asked the Nazims to write their ACRs, and waited till such time that either they were posted out and nearing their promotion zone, they would request the provincial authorities to write those ACRs. So this was pretty much diluted by this provision. The second, I think, a very important provision that I must mention was about the accounts and audit. I think a major reform in the local government system was that the principal accounting officer was a DCO, and district accounts committee of the council was created. The law's spirit was that the audit report should be placed before the local council, of course. And that was, creating a very powerful tool for local accountability. What in practice started happening was that the Auditor General of Pakistan first thought that auditing local governments was not his function, but then realized that that was an important area and created 27 regional audit offices of the federal government to audit local governments by certain interpretation of the law. And then there was another push by the federal government where the accounts of the local governments were also to be passed on to the Controller General of Accounts. So between that and this provision did not take shape, and when in 2008 newly elected provincial governments came up, some of you at least will be familiar with the story that those primary audit observations were used and highlighted in the press to build a case that massive corruption had happened in local governments, and it was used as an argument to scuttle local governments. So I'll just mention one more point and then stop here. Another, I think, important area was the variety of standards. So another good provision of the law was that the local governments were empowered, local councils were empowered in 21 areas where they could create their own local rules, and 42 areas where they could create bylaws. Now, for most of this work, they depended on civil servants. Now, civil servants were trained in, of course, central, modes of management, and this, I believe, worked in two ways. One, that for centrally trained local governments coming to the provinces from federal government, there has been always very little initiative to create province-specific rules or legislation. Mostly whatever is done by Punjab was adopted by the other three provinces. So the same technique was used there. Of course, the elected organs did not have the capacity to initiate much of this local level legislation. So very little work was done in this area, I think an important opportunity was missed on that. So I'll just stop here because I think I don't have any time, and Thank you very much.